The courtroom was steeped in a profound silence, broken only by the slow, methodical ticking of an old brass clock mounted high above the judge's bench. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, like a thunderstorm was about to break. Every breath drawn seemed hesitant, as if no one wanted to disturb the weight of what was unfolding. At the heart of the solemn chamber sat Emma Dawson, a delicate 6-year-old girl with wide hazel eyes that shimmered with both innocence and fear. Her small hands clutched tightly to a red leash, the end of which was wrapped securely around the collar of Rusty, a golden retriever whose coat gleamed like sunlight against the somber, wood-paneled walls. Rusty's steady presence was the only thing anchoring Emma in that moment. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wound them tighter into the soft, worn leather. The courtroom was no place for a child, yet here she was, pulled into a legal battle that would decide her future. Would she remain in the safe, loving arms of her foster family, or be returned to a man she barely knew, her biological father, whose presence filled her with a cold, paralyzing dread? Across the room, seated stiffly in his chair, was Grant Palmer, Emma's biological father. His eyes, cold and unreadable, never left her. His stare was like an anchor around her neck, weighing her down with memories she couldn't fully articulate, but which left her trembling nonetheless. There was something about him that made her chest tighten. Even without words, his gaze said more than enough. It silenced her. Emma shrank deeper in her chair, trying to disappear, wishing Rusty could pull her away to a place where none of this was happening. She wanted to be anywhere but here. Her voice, small and sweet under normal circumstances, was nowhere to be found. Her foster mother, Laura Bennett, sat just a few feet away in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Laura had always been a picture of warmth and reassurance, and today was no different. She caught Emma's eye and gave a gentle, encouraging nod. Her lips moved in a whisper, just loud enough for Emma to see, even if she couldn't hear it. "It's okay, sweetheart." The judge presiding over the case was an older man named Harold Whitaker. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his robe crisp and formal. His face, though stern, bore the faint lines of someone who had spent his life balancing the scales of justice. He leaned forward, his hands folded together on the bench, his eyes studying Emma with a mixture of concern and patience. "Emma," Judge Whitaker said, his voice soft but firm, "can you tell me, do you feel safe with your father?" The words floated in the stillness of the room, hanging there like heavy smoke. Emma's throat tightened. She couldn't answer, not with Grant sitting there watching her, not with those eyes. Fear had stolen her voice entirely. Sensing the shift in her breathing, Rusty nuzzled her gently, his golden head pressed softly into her side, his dark eyes gazing up at her with a quiet understanding only he seemed to possess. And then, like a lantern flickering back to life, Emma remembered something Laura had taught her. A secret signal, something only Rusty would recognize. She took a shaky breath and pressed 2 small fingers against Rusty's paw. It was subtle, barely a movement, but it was enough. Rusty's ears perked up instantly. His body stiffened, alert. And then, in an act that stunned the entire room, Rusty barked. Once, twice, 3 sharp, deliberate barks. Each one echoed in the courtroom, slicing through the tension like a blade. Judge Whitaker straightened, his brow furrowing. What was that? Laura's breath caught. She stood halfway from her seat, her hands trembling now. "It's a signal," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We taught Rusty to recognize when Emma feels scared but can't say it out loud." The room was silent again, but this time the air seemed charged. Everyone was listening. Everyone was watching. 3 barks, Laura continued, steadying herself. "They mean she feels unsafe." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Grant's attorney, a tall man with an expensive suit and a smug expression, scoffed. "Your Honor, it's just a dog barking," he said with an air of dismissal. "This isn't admissible. We can't take the word of an animal." Judge Whitaker held up a hand, silencing him immediately. His gaze softened as he turned back to Emma. "Emma," he said gently, "sweetheart, Are you afraid? Emma's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, she moved. She gave the smallest of nods. But it was enough. More than enough. Judge Whitaker leaned back, his face clouded with something between sorrow and resolve. He turned his attention to the two bailiffs standing by the door. "Please escort Mr. Palmer from the courtroom," he said, his voice as heavy as a gavel striking wood. Grant's mouth opened in protest, but before he could utter a word, the bailiffs were already moving. One stood behind him, the other beside. They didn't need to touch him. Their presence alone made it clear. With an exasperated sigh, Grant stood and left, his shoes clicking coldly against the marble floor. The moment the door shut behind him, Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body sagged, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Rusty licked her hand, as if to say, "You're safe now." She believed him. The judge took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice warmer now. "Emma, do you want to stay with Laura and Michael?" Michael Bennett, Laura's husband and Emma's foster father, was sitting beside Laura. His hand found hers and squeezed tightly. Emma looked at both of them, Laura's tear-filled eyes, Michael's quiet strength, and then she found something she hadn't had in days, her voice. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." Laura's tears spilled over. Michael closed his eyes for a brief second, his jaw tightening as he fought his own emotions. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire face. Judge Whitaker smiled too. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs. Some were murmurs of shock, others of admiration. A dog had spoken for a little girl when she couldn't speak for herself. Laura and Michael rushed forward, wrapping Emma in a cocoon of warmth and love. Rusty wagged his tail furiously, his golden fur catching the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. In that moment, it felt as though the room itself exhaled. That day, a silent cry for help had finally been heard, and it was the unwavering love of a dog that had made all the difference.